So the new theory that we're going to cover today is database first entity framework. And so everything we've done so far throughout our work in this semester has been code first entity framework. You start with the models and generate the database. This is the other way around, right? You have the database, you have the data in the database. How might you generate the C# models based on that? So you're basically creating the C# models and the context files. And so that's what we're going to do. We'll go ahead and create a new project, MVC, and this is database first, EF. Let's call it DB first. And so in the textbook, if you're following along, it's page 475. And basically what you're looking at, we covered a list of commands at the Package Manager Console. We covered that last week. And we kind of like dealt with migrations and applying migrations and undoing migrations and adding new migrations and updating the database, all this kind of stuff. There was one command that we looked at called scaffold DB context. And that scaffold DB context has a couple of parameters that are required. And so it's not just a standalone command. You have to pass in some additional parameters. And so we just have this basically empty solution, templated solution. We're going to go to the Package Manager Console. And typically you'll have a connection string that you store inside of your app settings. And so, when we look at our different databases, I guess the first thing is, well, what database are we going to create? Right now we don't have any models, right? But we do have what we just created, which is Bookstore, and that's a semi-complicated 3-4 tables, many-to-many, one-to-many relationships. So we have a database that we've created, and it's just called the Bookstore. And so what I figured we would do is just reverse that, right? We've got the Bookstore database, now let's create the models and whatnot from that database. So that's going to be the exercise. These are the tables. And again, the command is the scaffold -db context. And we need a connection string. Now the connection string we still have to code. And if I pull in that connection string from what we just got done doing, it will create the models, it will create the DB context, it will not create the connection string. So I still want to pull in the connection string from a prior piece of work. And so this is pretty typical of what we've been doing. So here we basically are saying a couple of things here. We have a database name, right? That's going to point at the database. And we're saying that this is a Microsoft SQL server called LocalDB. It's basically the free version of Microsoft SQL Server. It used to be called Express. Basically the very small SQL server. And like anything, if you ever were to take this into a production, Microsoft would want to charge you for using SQL Server, right? So they kind of give you the Express version for free. But in corporate America, in the real world, if this application that you're building were to scale, of course, they're going to want to charge you for a license for a full version of SQL Server. So you kind of get LocalDB for free, but of course, that's just in the learning environment. But that's just what we're using, right? That comes free when you install Visual Studio Community Edition, and you check the box that says you're going to do MVC development. It basically becomes loaded when you check that box. So that's kind of first step is let's figure out what database we're using. and then let's configure a connection string into that database that will be needed. And again, this is called bookstore context. That's going to be the name of our context file that basically allows us to make that connection to the database. And so the parameters that are required here, there's two of them, and they're on page 475, and that's the connection parameter and the provider. So the connection is basically going to point you at the connection string, right? So the command is scaffold db context. So if I'm kind of sitting here at the console, I'll type in this command, scaffold hyphen db context hyphen connection. And this is where we provide the name of bookstore context. So this is the name of our connection string. Okay, that's our first additional parameter that we have to provide. And the other required one is provider. And provider basically says, hey, this is SQL Server, is basically what you need to tell it. Now, in order for this to work, in order for this provider to work, let's go ahead and install the very normal package manager packages that we install for Entity Framework, just so this command works. So I'm going to go to NuGet Package Manager, and we're going to install Entity Framework SQL Server. And so here's the query, Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQL Server, and install that. And I'm going to install the tools.
It'd be nice to add like a frequently used packages.
Yeah, just like auto add it, don't even. Yeah, clear search, Entity Framework, tools. Okay, so now that we've installed those two packages, the likelihood of this command working goes up. So we are going to say the provider is Microsoft Entity Framework Core .SQL Server. Okay, and voila, we've got a lot going on, and we need to parse through what just happened, but I kind of mentioned what it will create is the bookstore context file. Kind of interesting that we don't have any of these in the models folder, just by default put it there. Well, we can change that. There's another switch that we can add to our command to get it into the models folder. So the fact that that worked is great, but it didn't put it in the right folder. So of course we could just drag and drop, and that's fine. Adjust namespaces and yes, and okay. That works. I guess if we were to, a couple notes, right, worth making is that you're going to notice that these are partial classes. A partial class is basically, you could take two partial classes and they're both going to be combined together at runtime. And so it's just to say, hey, part of the author is stored here. And the reason they make these partial classes, as the book explains, is that we can come in here and notice now none of our validation attributes are on here, right? None of our none of our data validation attributes are on here. So you probably are going to come in here and add these attributes. And so you can add these attributes. Now, there might be a case where your database design has changed and you want to rerun that scaffolding command. And the reason they make these partial classes, again, just what the book says, is that you wouldn't lose, like the required attribute if you were to add the data validation, add the namespace. The idea is that you can make changes to this file, and if you were to rerun the command later on, if these weren't partial classes, it would have to overwrite this, and you would lose the validation attributes that you added. Okay, so whatever, it's a partial class. If you make changes to it, and then you have to like rescaffold back from the database design changed, you need your models to reflect that change, so you need to rerun this command in the future. You don't lose the changes that you've made to these files. Okay, so that's why that's a partial class. If I were to rerun this command, so I'm just going to delete these. Delete the program. I did not mean to drag program.cs into there. Let's put program.cs back in the right location. Okay, save all. Let me just make sure I didn't bust it by accidentally moving that file. I don't think anything will. I don't think so, but let's just be sure. Okay, still running. Let's rerun this command and give an output directory. So the next switch is output directory. The folder to store the generated files, the default is the root folder for the product. So let's just say models. And I think, okay, that saved a step for us, right? So output directory / models is going to put everything there. Obviously we don't have the views, we don't have the controllers, so there's obviously pieces missing here, right? But this is basically the step that's needed to start from a database first. Yep. Okay. Okay. So again, the attributes aren't there. You would need to decorate these attributes on these properties for validation or what have you. Another thing you're going to notice is that dependency injection is not in here, right? So again, this is something we've been doing for a while that needs to be added. So if you go into any other app that we've been doing, the one that we did today, and we bring in our line for dependency injection. So after add controllers with a view, we need to bring that in. And stop that. My understanding is that database first, well, at least in this class, we're not going to be doing a whole lot of database first, right? So we're going through the exercise, showing you how you can do it, but for the most part, we'll be doing code first, entity framework. So it's good, we're doing it, getting it to work. And so we have the dependency injection. And then let's go to this bookstore context. This looks right. the constructor but this does not. So the on configuring, we've done on model creating, and this is where we kind of put the seed data. And you can see here, there's a lot going on there. But this on configuring returns this use SQL Server name of bookstore context. So as I paused all that, basically, this basically says use your connection string called bookstore context, but they point out the best place to just you have your connection string inside of app settings. So it's basically duplicate. You can see there's 0 references. They say you could clean up this method, the on configuring method, after it has been cleaned up. So protected override void on configuring DB options builder. And then in the curlies, we add some curlies. Base on configuring. And that basically says use your connection string that's going to be stored in app settings. So, okay, cleaned up that line of code. Okay. Now this next part is a little interesting. So here's the partial class book. And we're actually going to make another class that works in conjunction with this. Okay, so here's kind of what we're looking at. So this is a partial class that was generated by that command, right? We didn't create this class, but the idea is that we want to add to it, and we're going to add to it in such a way that if you were to regenerate this file, you wouldn't lose the code that you've added, right? So we're going to make another partial class called book that's going to add another property. And again, these kind of two classes are going to be combined into one class called book. Now, I personally learned object-oriented with Java. And one rule that I learned that I've never really been comfortable with breaking is that your class has to be the same name as the file. So you pay kind of close attention here. The class is called book, and the file is named book.cs. Capital B, everything mattered. Like it was case sensitive, and they had to be an exact match. And so if I want to make another class called book, obviously I can't add that class of book inside of this models folder. Otherwise, the names would collide. You can't have two file names by the same file in the same folder. So you have two options. Option one is you can call this file something else and still be partial class of book. Or option two would be to make another folder and store the book.cs in that other folder. So you kind of have two options. Option number one is what I'm going to go with. I'm going to create this other class by a different file name, but then the class name will be class of book. So the convention here, I'm not particularly exactly sure what I should name this file. Again, you want to just name it book. Now, let's call this book kind of I'm not sure of I'm really unsure of the convention, so I just call this book 2 public partial class. I'm just going to call book. Now, again, this really does not sit well with me because, again, historically, your file name should always match the name of the class. So that would be, this would be one potential option, right? Having a file name, and what we wind up doing here is adding another property to it. And so for me, because I don't like this, I might even change it. Now title is a property that it should be getting from here, right? So it could tell, because this is a partial class of book, I'm really glad that that's picking that up, because obviously that's coming from book.title, so that's working. Okay, now the naming convention could be improved. I don't like it, but it is in fact working. So that's good. So maybe I don't touch it. So that if you did regenerate these classes, you know, you wouldn't lose this additional property. Now, as far as putting data validation on it, right? So let's say you want to put some data validation on price. You would not do it right here. Instead, okay, again, because if you would regenerate it, you would lose whatever was in this file. So let's add another class. Call it book metadata. Okay, and we're going to have to see how to link this together. So I'm going to add a range validation from 0 to double dot max value with the error message Okay, so here's book metadata, and this one is a regular class, but now what we can do is back on our book, we might have to add a using statement here on our class of book. On the, excuse me, we're going to do it over here because this is the file that we're not losing. We're going to bring in model metadata type of book metadata. It's kind of a roundabout way of applying this price validation, right? Because this file is not going to be deleted. This file is not going to be deleted. However, this file would be regenerated if you reran that command. So we added our own partial class. We added a property to it. We added some validation over here on this property called price. And that's how you link all that fun stuff together. And the last paragraph, I think, is worth reading before we're done. It says, at this point, you might be wondering why you just can't include the data validation attributes in the book partial class that adds a property called has title. The reason is that to add data validation attributes, you need to code the property you want to validate. For instance, you would need to code price property if you wanted to decorate it with data validation attributes. But because the price property isn't already added code in the generated book partial class, the compiler won't let you code it a second time in another partial class. So you're going to notice here, like it recognized title, right? Because it's a partial class. So you couldn't code another property called price, right? You couldn't put another property called price here because it recognizes it's a partial class. So here, you put it here as its own property of this unique class, book metadata, and then kind of wired it in this way. All right. Let's stop that there. That was a shorter one by my standards, 27 minutes.